He went into that river to save her. He didn't know she went into that river to save him. Lieutenant Caden Nash had survived 10 years of combat, 4 deployments, and every physical test the Navy had ever designed for the human body. None of that prepared him for what a drowning dog did to him when she placed her paw against his chest in 8 feet of freezing mountain water. That one moment changed the direction of everything. Before we show you how this story ends, and why nobody in that valley saw it coming, drop your city in the comments right now. Subscribe with the bell on. This one will stay with you. Caden Nash had been on medical leave for 19 days and had not once used the word healing to describe any part of it. He was 30 years old, short dark brown hair, a build that 10 years of Navy SEAL service had made into something functional rather than decorative, and a face that looked older than 30 in the way faces look older when they have spent significant time in places that don't care about the age of the person inside them. He wore his NWU Type 3 uniform every morning without thinking about it, the digital camouflage of green and brown that had become more natural to him than anything else in his wardrobe. Old habit. The uniform felt like a container. Without it, he was less certain of where he ended and everything else began. Commander Joel Farr had arranged the cabin in the Cascade Mountains of Washington State because Caden had run out of the energy required to make his own arrangements. The medical board had used words like acute stress response and recommended separation from operational duty, and Caden had sat in that room, listening to those words, and understood that arguing would cost him more than complying. So he had complied. The cabin had no internet. The cell signal disappeared past the first quarter mile of the access road. There was a river close enough to hear from the porch at night. Farr had described all of this as exactly what you need. Caden had not disagreed out loud, because disagreeing out loud required caring about the outcome. And caring about outcomes was the one thing the previous 6 months had taken from him most completely. He walked the South Trail on the morning of day 19 because it was the only trail he had not yet walked, and because forward motion was the closest approximation to peace he had found in this place. The Rimrock River was running high and loud, the specific anger of a mountain waterway that has been given too much snowmelt too quickly and has not yet decided what to do with it. He heard it before he saw it. A sound inside the river. Broken, compressed, stripped of everything except raw need. The last version of a bark that still had any breath left in it. Caden stopped walking. The sound came again. He moved toward the bank and looked out across the water and found her. A German shepherd caught on a half-submerged log 12 feet from the near shore, fighting the current with the spent, furious determination of an animal that had been fighting for longer than it had reserves for. Her tan and gold coat was plastered dark against her body. The black markings across her back were visible even soaked and matted. Her head was barely above the water. Her front legs were moving. Her back legs had nothing solid. Her amber eyes crossed the water and found him. And in those eyes, there was no calculation and no performance. Just the direct, clean signal of a living thing that has reached the outer limit of what it can do alone. Caden went into the water before he finished deciding to. The cold hit him like a physical event. It compressed his chest and took the first breath he tried to draw and replaced it with something sharp and involuntary. He had been in colder water, in worse situations, and his body remembered how to move through the protest of it. He kept his eyes on the dog and kicked against the current and covered the 12 feet in 40 seconds of effort that cost him more than 12 feet usually cost. She did not thrash when he reached her. She did not scramble. She leaned into his arm with the full weight of an animal that had made a decision about him in the same instant he had made one about her. He wrapped his other arm around the log for stability and felt the current push hard against his chest, and breathed through it and turned them toward shore. The rimrock didn't let them go easily. It pushed back against every kick with the complete indifference of something that has no opinion about who makes it across and who doesn't. Caden's shoulder hit a submerged rock and sent white through his vision for a second, and he kept moving. He had been trained to keep moving through white in his vision. He had been trained to keep moving through most things. His boots found the bank mud. He staggered up, and they collapsed together onto the wet earth, both of them breathing hard, river water streaming from two bodies that had just survived something the river had not intended them to survive. He stayed there for a moment, hands on his knees, oxygen debt paying itself back. The dog was beside him, breathing, her chest moving in the recovering rhythm of something that has just come back from the edge. Then she lifted one paw and placed it against the front of his NWU uniform. Not scrambling, not pushing for balance, placing it with the deliberate and gentle purpose of a gesture that meant something. He felt the pressure of it through the fabric against his chest, and he looked down at the tan and gold paw resting on the green and brown camouflage, and something happened in the space behind his sternum that he had not felt in 6 months. Not large, not dramatic, small and warm and entirely real. He sat back on his heels and looked at her. She looked back at him with the amber eyes that had found him across 12 feet of current and had not looked away. He did not know this dog. He did not know her name or her history or where she had come from or how she had ended up in a mountain river in April fighting alone. He knew that she had placed her paw on his chest and that the warmth it produced was the first thing he had felt since before the medical board that did not require effort to feel. "Okay," he said quietly, to himself as much as to her. "Okay." He got his arms under her and lifted. She was heavy with water and dense with muscle, the build of a working dog rather than a companion dog. And she lay against his chest with her head on his shoulder and her breathing slow, and the amber eyes tracking the trail ahead, as if she was already planning what came next. He carried her back to the cabin. He told himself he would find who she belonged to. He told himself this was temporary. He told himself these things in the reasonable and serious voice he used when he was trying to convince himself of something he had already stopped believing. He set her down near the cabin's wood stove and found a towel and knelt beside her, rubbing the water from her coat in long, careful strokes. She lay still and looked at him. Not at the fire, not at the unfamiliar room, at him, with the specific attention of a dog who has decided that a person is the most important thing in the current environment and is going to make sure that person knows it. "You're not a stray," he said. She blinked once. He ran his hands over her fur and found no collar, no tag. The fur along her back carried the texture of a dog regularly groomed and maintained. Her paws were calloused, the way field dogs' paws are calloused. Her muscles had the density of consistent work. She had belonged to someone who had taken care of her and trained her, and the absence of all identifying information was a problem to solve, rather than a fact that explained itself. He got his phone and found the number for the Regional Animal Authority, and listened to a voicemail message and left his own message, and set the phone down and looked at her. "I'm going to find who you belong to," he said. She looked at him steadily, not disagreeing, not agreeing, just present, just entirely, calmly, and without apology, present. He called Commander Farr that evening because Farr was the only person whose calls he consistently returned. "How are you sleeping?" Farr asked, the question he always asked first. "Same," Caden said, which was the answer he always gave, which was not accurate, but required less energy than accuracy. You need to actually rest, Caden. That's the whole point of the leave. I pulled a dog out of the river today. A pause. What kind of dog? German Shepherd. She was caught on a log in the current. I went in. Another pause. This one different. The kind Far used when he was paying close attention without wanting to signal how much. Is she okay? She's fine, sitting next to me right now. He looked down. She was sitting next to him, pressed against his leg with a warmth that he had stopped noticing as a separate sensation, because it had already integrated itself into his awareness as simply the way things currently were. Far, how long is this supposed to take? The leave? Whatever this is. Far was quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet when he was giving a person room to hear what they were actually asking. I don't know, he said finally. But I know that the fact that you're asking means something is moving. Caden looked at the dog. Give her a name, Far said, if you're keeping her for now. The call ended. Caden sat with the dog in the small cabin, while the mountain dark pressed against the windows and the river ran loud below the ridge. He looked at her coat in the firelight, the tan and gold catching the orange glow, the warmth of her against his leg, like a living anchor. Something that existed at the intersection of warmth and permanence, not fire which consumed itself. Something that lasted longer, that could start fires rather than just be one. Ember, he said. She turned her head and looked at him, the amber eyes holding the firelight. Then she turned back to the room and continued her quiet, comprehensive assessment of every corner of the space they shared, the way working dogs assess every space they are responsible for. She had already decided she was responsible for this one. She had already decided she was responsible for him. He didn't know that yet. He would spend the next several weeks finding out. That night, for the first time in 6 months, he slept through to morning, without the particular quality of waking that had made every previous night its own small emergency. He woke at first light, with Ember pressed against the side of the bed, and the mountain air coming cold and clear through the gap in the window he had learned to leave open. He lay still for a moment, and felt the warmth of her, and listened to the river below the ridge. He had come to this mountain to disappear. He had pulled a drowning dog from a river, because the sound she made was not the kind of sound a person trained to respond to emergencies could walk past. And she had come back with him, and named herself into his life the way some things name themselves, not by being declared, but by becoming undeniable. Whatever was moving, as Far had said, was moving. He put his hand on Ember's back, and she exhaled once, slow and full, the breath of an animal that is exactly where it intends to be. Outside, the river ran. The mountain morning arrived in layers of cold and light, and the particular quiet of a place that had learned to hold difficult things without being diminished by them. Caden Nash, 30 years old, maybe SEAL, 19 days into a leave that was supposed to be about healing, and had not yet been that, lay in a cabin in the Cascades, with a dog he had pulled from a river, pressing her warm weight against his leg. He was not healed, but he was here, and something was different about here this morning. He got up. He put on his uniform. He went to the door and opened it, and Ember was beside him before he had it fully open, amber eyes moving over the trail ahead with the attentive certainty of a dog who has already decided that wherever he is going, she is going too. The river below the ridge ran fast and cold, and the morning light was coming in clean across the mountains. Caden took one breath of the cold air and looked at his dog, and felt something he had almost forgotten the name for. Not healed, not fixed, not the dramatic recovery that television and medical boards implied was the shape of these things. Something quieter. A direction. A next step. Something to walk toward. Ember walked forward, and he followed her. He always would. She was not a stray. He had known it since the first morning. But on the third day, the evidence became impossible to dismiss. Caden was checking the property fence line along the south ridge when Ember stopped walking and lowered her nose to the frozen ground, with the specific, focused intensity of a dog that has shifted from general awareness to active tracking. Not sniffing the way dogs sniff out of curiosity. Sniffing the way trained animals sniff when they have found a scent trail that the situation requires them to follow. He stopped and watched her work. She moved in a tight, deliberate pattern, nose sweeping left and right in short arcs, her tan and gold body staying low, her black saddled back level and controlled. She was not excited. She was methodical. There was a profound difference between those two things, and Caden recognized it immediately because he had spent a decade being methodical in situations where excitement got people killed. "What do you have?" he said quietly. Ember didn't look up. She followed the invisible line in the ground, 6 feet forward, and stopped at a section of fence where 2 posts joined. The wire between them looked intact at first glance. Caden crouched and looked closer. The bottom strand had been cut and bent back into approximate shape by someone who knew that a clean bent wire was harder to notice than a broken one. It had been done with tools, done with intention. Someone had used this fence line as a crossing point and had tried to make the crossing look like it hadn't happened. Caden took out his phone and photographed the wire, then the ground on both sides. Boot prints, partially filled by overnight frost, but readable if you knew how to read them. Deep heel strike, heavy tread, the weight distribution of someone carrying a load rather than just moving through terrain. He measured the prints against his own boot and calculated the size. Large. And the stride length was the stride of someone familiar with this ground. Not someone exploring. Someone with a route. He stood and looked at Ember. She was already 6 feet ahead, still tracking, already past the fence and moving northwest along whatever thread of information the ground was giving her. He followed her. They found the first stake 20 minutes later. Orange plastic, driven flush with the frozen earth, almost invisible unless you were already looking at ground level. Caden might have stepped over it without noticing. Ember stopped beside it and looked at him with the amber eyes and the particular expression she had been developing for the last 3 days. The expression that said, "I found it, and now you need to do something with what I found." He crouched. The stake was not a trail marker. The placement was wrong for hiking infrastructure, and this section of the reserve didn't have maintained trails this far from the access road. It was driven at the base of a natural rise that blocked sightlines from the south, which meant someone standing at this stake was invisible to anyone approaching from the direction of the cabin and the access road. He photographed it and kept walking northwest, and they found 4 more in the next mile, each one positioned at a point that corresponded to a natural feature, a bend in the creek bed, a gap between 2 large pines, a rocky outcrop. Someone had mapped a route through this terrain for repeat use in low light. Someone who knew that moving quickly through mountain terrain at night required reference points that didn't require a flashlight to see at close range. Caden stood at the 6th stake and felt the familiar tightening in his awareness that preceded operational clarity. Not excitement, the opposite of excitement. The specific calm of a mind that has identified a problem and shifted into the mode it was built for. He called Commander Farr. "There's been traffic through the property," he said. "Someone cut the south fence and staked a route through the north sector. Repeat use based on the bootwear patterns. They're carrying loads." Farr was quiet for 2 seconds. "How confident?" "The fence work is professional. The stake placement is tactical. Someone who knows terrain is running a corridor through this reserve. Call the local ranger service. I did 3 days ago about the dog. Still waiting on a call back. Then call the sheriff. I'm going to, but I want to understand the route first. Caden looked at Ember, who was sitting beside the sixth stake and watching the northwest tree line with her ears locked forward. The dog is tracking something. She's been working the whole route without prompting. A pause that meant Farr was recalibrating. What kind of training does she have? Detection and field work. Whoever trained her did it properly. She's not guessing. She's reading. Caden watched Ember's ears move. There's something up ahead she wants me to see. Caden. Farr's voice shifted into the specific register he used when he was saying something that mattered. You're on medical leave. I know what I'm on. This is not your operation. I know that too. He looked northwest, where Ember was still watching. I'm just walking my dog. Farr was quiet long enough that Caden could hear the decision being made. Call me when you know what it is. And Caden, don't do anything alone. The call ended. Ember looked at him over her shoulder, the amber eyes patient and certain. He was taking too long, and she knew it. All right, he said. Show me. She moved northwest along the staked route for another half-mile, staying low to the ground when the terrain opened up, choosing the covered path through the trees when it was available. Caden followed, and absorbed the fact that she was moving the way canine units moved during operational searches. Not instinct, not exploration. Training. Consistent, applied, refined training that had become second nature to the point where it was indistinguishable from instinct. She stopped at the edge of a natural hollow, where the creek bed dipped below grade. She did not go in. She sat at the rim of the hollow, nose elevated, taking slow, deliberate breaths. And then she looked at Caden and made the low sound in her chest that was not quite a growl and not quite a bark. The sound that meant, here, and be careful. He moved to her position and looked into the hollow. The bait station was set against the natural deer run that curved through the hollow's lowest point, not the crude setup of an opportunistic poacher. This was purpose-built. The container was professional grade. The compound inside it had the specific chemical smell that Caden associated with veterinary toxicology from a training brief he had attended 3 years ago on wildlife crime. Not something a person sourced from a hardware store, something sourced from a supplier who knew what it was for. He photographed everything with the systematic coverage of someone who had documented evidence in environments where the documentation mattered as much as the evidence itself. Then he stepped back and looked at Ember, and she looked at him, and neither of them needed to have the conversation out loud, because the conversation was already complete. This was not accidental. This was organized. And the route through the south fence, the staked corridor, the professionally set bait station, all of it added up to an operation that had been running in this sector for longer than 3 days. Longer than 19 days. Possibly much longer. Good girl, he said. She pressed briefly against his leg and then straightened and went back to watching the hollow's approach routes. He heard the footsteps 30 seconds later. Not from the hollow. From behind him, approaching along the creek bed with the unhurried confidence of someone who belonged to this terrain and knew it completely. He turned without urgency, keeping his body language neutral, and waited. Dr. Lena Marsh came through the tree line with a field camera around her neck and a kit bag on her shoulder, and the particular expression of someone who has just found an unexpected person standing at a location they have been monitoring for 3 months. She was in her early 30s, dark hair back, hazel eyes that moved quickly between Caden, the hollow, and Ember in the way of someone professionally trained to read environments rather than just see them. She stopped 8 feet away. "That station is mine," she said. Her voice was precise and wary. "I documented it 2 days ago, as part of a poisoning case investigation. Wildlife veterinarian? Caden asked. And ranger, part-time. Lena Marsh. She studied him with the directness of a person who had learned that politeness was a tool rather than a default. You're not a hiker. No. The uniform. She nodded at his NWU Type 3. Military. Navy. Medical leave. He held out his phone with the photographs he had taken. I found the fence cut on the south property line and followed the stake route from there. The dog tracked it. Lena came closer and looked at the photographs. Her jaw tightened on the fence-cut image. That's new. He's expanding the entry points. She scrolled to the stake photographs. These match the route I've been tracking from the north. They connect. She looked at Ember, who was watching her with calm, evaluative attention. She found this without cues. She's been finding things without cues since I pulled her out of the rimrock 3 days ago. Lena's eyes moved to Caden with a different quality of attention. The river? She was caught on a log in the current. I went in. Something shifted in Lena's expression, brief and controlled, but present. I've been looking for a dog matching that description for 3 months. She crouched in front of Ember, keeping her movements slow. She belonged to a search and rescue coordinator named Paul Wister. He was killed in the trail collapse in January. She disappeared from the scene. Lena let Ember sniff her hand. We thought she was gone. Caden felt the information settle, the absence of collar and tag, the level of training, the way she had come to him in the river with the trust of a dog that was not lost, but waiting. Paul Wister had taught her everything she knew, and then Paul Wister had not come back from the mountain, and she had been alone until the river. She's not gone, Caden said. His voice was level. He was working to keep it level. Lena stood and looked at him with the hazel eyes that missed very little. No, she said. She found someone. Ember stood and walked 6 feet north and stopped, nose elevated. The motion pulled both of them out of the moment and back into the situation they were standing in the middle of. Who's running the bait operation? Caden asked. Lena's expression tightened. Wade Cutter, former hunting guide, lost his license 2 years ago for a poaching citation. He knows this reserve better than anyone, except the animals that live in it. She looked at the hollow. He's been poisoning the Rimrock sector for wildlife trafficking. Foxes, lynx, 2 black bear calves in 8 weeks. The compounds he uses don't show in standard toxicology. She paused. He's not working alone, and he's not small scale. The staked corridor. He uses it to move product out at night. That's my assessment. She looked at Caden. I've been building a case for 3 months. I need the route documented, and I need a witness account of the bait stations that holds up to an evidentiary standard. She held his gaze. You're describing exactly the evidence I need. I'm on medical leave, he said. I know. This isn't my operation. I know that too, she nodded at Ember, who was still watching the north tree line with the focused patience of a dog that has identified something that hasn't resolved yet. But your dog seems to have a different opinion. Caden looked at Ember. Ember looked back at him, over her shoulder, with the amber eyes and the expression that had become his most reliable source of honest information in the last 3 days. Then she looked north again, with her ears locked and her body still. Someone was in the trees, not moving, watching. How dangerous is Cutter? Caden asked quietly. Lena's answer was immediate and did not hedge. He's been linked to 2 disappearances, both people who got too close to his operation. Neither case was closed. She lowered her voice further. He sees a threat in everyone, and he doesn't wait to find out if he's right. Ember growled. Once. Low and directional, aimed at the north tree line. Not alarm. Identification. Something in the trees moved and went still again. A deliberate half movement, the announcement of a presence that wanted to be felt without being confirmed. Caden did not turn toward the trees. He had been in enough situations to know that the worst thing a person could do when they were being watched was demonstrate that they knew they were being watched, because that collapsed the ambiguity that kept them safe. "Walk naturally," he said to Lena, keeping his voice below the threshold the trees could catch. "Back toward the creek bed. Don't change your pace." She understood immediately. She turned toward the creek with the practiced ease of someone who had learned to manage her own adrenaline in the field. Caden fell in beside her, and Ember moved with them, body still angled toward the north tree line, growl still running low in her chest, like a warning that hadn't finished being delivered. They made it 40 yards before Caden heard the snap of a single twig behind them. Not accidental. Timed. A message delivered in the language of the woods to anyone who knew how to receive it. He knows we were there. He wants us to know he knows. Caden clenched his jaw and kept walking. Beside him, Lena had gone very still in her stride. The particular stillness of someone processing a threat at the same time they were pretending not to have received it. "He was there the whole time," she said. "Yes," Caden said. She exhaled once. "Now he knows I have a witness." And now we know he was watching his bait station. Caden looked at Ember, who had shifted her attention from the trees to the path ahead, with the decisive focus of a dog that has assessed the immediate threat and moved on to the next phase of the situation. "How much documentation do you need before you can move on him?" Lena was quiet for a moment. "More than we have, but a lot less than I had this morning." They reached the point where the creek trail split, and Lena stopped. She looked at Caden with a directness that had been consistent in her from the moment she stepped out of the tree line. "Tomorrow morning," she said. "I want to run the full corridor and document every station. If Ember can find them the way she found this one," she looked at the dog. Ember looked back at her with the measured approval she gave to people who had demonstrated good judgment. "It changes everything." Caden looked north toward the trees where a man had stood watching them and said nothing, and broken one twig to make sure they understood exactly what his silence meant. 6 a.m., he said. "We'll be at the south fence line." Lena nodded and moved down her trail. Caden watched her go, and then looked at Ember, and Ember looked at him, and the mountain went very quiet around them. The specific quiet of a place where something has just shifted from one kind of situation into another. He put his hand on her back. "Good work today," he said. Ember pressed against his palm once, and then turned back toward the cabin and began walking. Caden fell in beside her, uniform damp from the morning cold, the photographs on his phone and the coordinates in his memory, and the certainty in his chest that whatever Wade Cutter thought he was watching from those trees, he had not accounted for a dog who could find invisible things, or the man who had learned in 3 days to trust her completely. Lena was already at the south fence line when Caden and Ember arrived at 6 the following morning. She had her field kit, her camera, and the expression of someone who had not slept well, but had used the sleeplessness productively. She handed Caden a folded topographic printout without greeting him, the way people who have worked in the field for a long time skip social ceremony when there is actual work to do. "I mapped the stake positions you photographed against the sector grid," she said. "The route connects to a natural drainage channel that runs to the Forest Service Road 4 miles northwest. If Cutter is moving product out, that road is how he does it." She pointed to 2 marked positions on the map. "I need documented evidence at these 2 stations before I can take what I have to the Federal Wildlife Authority. 1 witness photograph with GPS timestamp is not enough. 2 corroborating witnesses with full documentation changes the legal threshold entirely." Caden looked at the map. "You've been building this for 3 months. "I've been watching animals disappear for 3 months," she said. "Building the case took longer because every time I got close, he moved." She looked at Ember, who was already working the ground at the fence line, nose down, body methodical. "She's going to change the timeline." Ember found the first news station in 40 minutes. It was 200 yards east of the original hollow, set in the natural cover of a downed cedar trunk, along what Caden now recognized as the secondary deer run that intersected the primary at the drainage channel. The bait was fresher than yesterday's, recent enough that Caden felt his jaw tighten when Lena confirmed the timestamp would show activity within the last 8 hours. "He was here last night," Lena said, crouching over the documentation with the controlled urgency of someone who has been waiting a long time for exactly this kind of evidence. "After we left." He's not slowing down because he knows someone is watching. Caden looked at the tree line to the north. He's accelerating. Why would he accelerate? Because someone spooked him. Because he wants to move product before the situation changes. He looked at Ember, who had finished her documentation circuit of the station and was sitting 6 feet back with her nose elevated, reading the air in the direction of the drainage channel. Or because he's already planning to close down this sector and move somewhere else. Lena looked up from her camera. "If he moves before I have enough to bring to federal authority, he disappears, sets up the same operation somewhere else in the reserve, and I start over. Then we move faster." Caden looked at Ember. "Track." She was already moving before the word finished. The second station was a mile northwest, and Ember found it by scent alone from 40 feet out, stopping and marking the position without going closer, understanding in the way that trained dogs understand that the evidence itself should not be disturbed before the humans have finished with it. Lena documented while Caden watched the approaches. The station here was larger, more product, more sophisticated containment. This was not a satellite point in Cutter's network. This was a collection node. "This is where he aggregates," Caden said. Lena stood and looked at the setup with the expression of someone seeing 3 months of theory confirmed in a single visual. "This is the one that matters. If I can tie this to the route, and to the fence cut, and to the compounds, the federal case builds itself." She photographed everything from 6 angles, and then photographed Caden's GPS position display, and her own, and then stood and looked at him. "This is enough. This is the documentation threshold." Ember raised her head and went rigid. Not the focused stillness of active tracking. The complete, full-body lock of an animal that has received information that changes the category of the situation. Caden was beside her in 2 steps, crouching, hand on her back. "What do you have?" Ember's growl started before he finished asking. Deep, directional, aimed not at the trail they had come from, or the tree line to the north, but at the drainage channel directly ahead. The channel Lena's map identified as the exit route. The channel that, if someone were approaching from the Forest Service Road, would funnel them directly to this node. Lena read Caden's posture and went still instantly. "Someone's coming." From the northwest, not hiking pace. He stood slowly, keeping his movements controlled. "How far is the nearest point where you have cell signal?" "Half-mile south, maybe more." "Get there. Call the sheriff. Tell them you have a commercial wildlife trafficking operation with active evidence and a suspect identity, and you need deputies at the Forest Service Road access point on Route 14. He looked at Ember. "Give them Cutter's name. Give them the route." Lena moved. She had the field instincts to move without debating and the professional training to know that calling for backup before a situation escalated was not retreat, it was protocol. She went south along the creek bed at a controlled run that didn't produce more sound than necessary. Caden stayed. He stayed because leaving meant the evidence station went unwatched, and unwatched evidence in an ongoing criminal operation had a way of disappearing. He stayed because Ember had not moved from her position, and Ember's position told him that whatever was coming from the drainage channel was close enough that retreating south would mean meeting it on worse ground. He stayed because 10 years of operational experience had calibrated his risk assessment to a precision that medical boards misread as recklessness, and that was actually the opposite of recklessness. He pulled out his phone and started recording. Ember's growl deepened. She took one step forward and stopped, the movement of an animal marking her defensive position rather than advancing toward a threat. Wade Cutter came through the drainage channel mouth 30 seconds later. He was exactly as Lena had described him. Broad, weathered, black hair under a field cap. The physical presence of someone who had spent decades in rough terrain and had been made by it rather than worn down by it. He was carrying a field bag over one shoulder, and he had a rifle slung across his back in the casual way of a man who carried it out of habit rather than immediate intent. He stopped when he saw Caden. His eyes moved. Caden, the evidence station. Ember, back to Caden. The calculation happened fast and was visible in the specific flattening of his expression that comes when a man has assessed a situation and decided his response. "Private property," Cutter said. His voice was low and had no question in it. "Federal Conservation Reserve," Caden said. "No private ownership within a half-mile of where you're standing." Cutter looked at the evidence station, at the GPS tags Lena had placed, at the camera angles she had documented. His jaw moved once. "You've been busy." 3 months of documentation, Caden said. "We finished this morning." The word "we" did something to Cutter's expression. He scanned the tree line for Lena and didn't find her, and that calculation was also visible. "You're alone," he said. "I'm not alone." Caden looked at Ember, who was holding her position with the absolute unbroken focus of a dog that had trained for exactly this, and was performing that training without any instruction, because it was no longer training. It was simply what she did. "And the documentation is already off this mountain." That was the lie. The documentation was on Lena's camera, moving south toward cell signal at a controlled run. But Cutter did not know that, and the specific confidence in Caden's voice produced the specific hesitation in Cutter that Caden needed. Cutter's hand moved toward the rifle sling. Ember was already in motion when his hand moved. She covered the ground in the flat, explosive arc of a dog that has been released by a situation rather than a command. And she hit Cutter's forearm with the full weight and speed of 80 pounds of working dog at full velocity. The rifle came off the sling and hit the ground 3 feet away. Cutter went back a step and came forward with his fist, and Ember took the impact on her shoulder and pivoted, and her teeth found his wrist and held. Not a kill bite, a control bite. The bite that says, "I have you, and what happens next is your choice." Cutter roared. He used his free hand to grab for Ember's collar, and Caden was moving before the grab landed, covering the distance and taking Cutter's free arm at the elbow with a leverage technique that converted a larger opponent's momentum into a controlled takedown. Cutter went down hard. He tried to rise, and Caden's knee was in the center of his back, with a weight and precision that communicated without language that rising was not available. "Don't," Caden said. Cutter went still. Ember released his wrist and repositioned to Cutter's far side, sitting with her amber eyes on him and her body between him and the rifle on the ground. The specific placement of a dog who has assessed the threat geometry and covered the most dangerous variable without being asked. Caden looked at his hands on Cutter's arm. They were steady. They had been steady through all of it. He registered that with the particular quiet of a man who has spent 19 days uncertain about who he still was, and has just received an answer in a mountain drainage channel, with his dog sitting 3 feet away, keeping a rifle secured. His phone was still recording. He had not stopped recording when Cutter came through the channel mouth. The footage was time-stamped, GPS embedded, and captured everything from Cutter's approach to the position of his hand on the rifle sling to where he was now. Sirens started in the southeast, not close yet, but approaching, the sound traveling across mountain terrain in the way it travels when the route is clear and the destination is known. Lena had made it to signal. Ember looked at Caden over Cutter's immobilized body, the amber eyes completely present and completely steady, not scanning anymore, not working the approaches or reading the air for new threats, just looking at him with the specific quality of attention she had given him since the river, the attention that said, "I am here, and you are not alone, and we did this together, and it was enough." He exhaled, slow and full, the breath of a man who has just come through something and found himself still standing on the right side of it. "Good girl," he said. Ember's tail moved once, the same single arc it always made when she had done what she came to do. Just once. Enough. The sirens grew louder. Cutter lay still under Caden's weight, with the particular stillness of a man who has run the final calculation and found that all the available outcomes from this moment forward belong to someone else. 2 Chelan County deputies came down the drainage channel from the northwest 4 minutes later, which meant Lena had given them the route and they had come in from the Forest Service Road rather than fighting through the reserve. Smart. The kind of approach a person recommends when they know the terrain and want to cut off the exit. The first deputy looked at Caden kneeling on Cutter's back, and at Ember sitting beside them, and at the evidence station with his documentation tags, and said, "Sir, we're going to need you to walk us through what happened here." "Everything's on the phone," Caden said. He held it up with his free hand. "From the moment he came out of the channel, and my partner documented the station before he arrived." The deputy looked at Ember. "The dog?" "Human partner," Caden said. "She went south to get you." He paused. "The dog found the station." The deputy looked at Ember again. Ember looked back at him with the amber eyes and the calm, measuring attention she gave to every new person. The assessment that ran quickly and settled into a verdict she never saw reason to revise. She approved of the deputy. Her tail moved once. Cutter was in custody 7 minutes after the sirens reached the drainage channel. The second deputy secured the rifle and began photographing the evidence station, while the first took Caden's preliminary statement. Lena arrived from the South Trail, breathing hard from the run, her camera in one hand and the GPS documentation in the other. And she looked at the scene, and then at Caden, with the hazel eyes that moved quickly over everything and arrived at their assessments without delay. "He had a rifle," she said, not a question. Ember took it out of the equation. Lena looked at the dog. Ember sat at Caden's left boot, in the position she had held since the deputies arrived. Body angled outward, amber eyes still working the perimeter, because the shift was not over until it was over. Lena's expression moved through something complicated and settled on something that was not quite admiration and not quite grief, but lived in the space between them. "Paul trained her for exactly this," she said quietly. "He always said she was the best dog he'd ever worked with." She stopped. "He would have wanted her to keep working." Caden looked down at Ember. Ember looked up at him. The amber eyes clear and present and entirely without sentimentality, because dogs did not carry grief the way people carried it. They carried forward. They carried the training and the bond and the work. And they offered those things to the next person who needed them, with the same completeness they had offered them to the first. Paul Wister had taught her everything she knew. She had taken everything she knew to a river in April, and she had waited in that river for the person who would follow her out of it. Caden put his hand on her back. She pressed into it once and then turned back to the perimeter, because there was still a perimeter, and someone needed to watch it. "Yeah," he said, to her, to himself, to the mountain and the morning and everything the last 3 days had moved into place without announcing itself. He really would have. The Chelan County Sheriff's substation was 40 minutes down the Forest Service Road, and Caden spent most of those 40 minutes in the back of a deputy's vehicle, with Ember pressed against his leg and his phone in his hand, reviewing the footage he had recorded from the moment Cutter came through the drainage channel. It was clean, time-stamped, GPS-embedded, continuous from approach to takedown. Cutter's hand going to the rifle sling was visible in the 4th minute of footage, clear enough that a defense attorney would need to work hard to contextualize it as anything other than what it was. Ember's response and Caden's response, and the position of the rifle after it hit the ground. All of it documented in the involuntary, unchoreographed way that made field footage more credible than anything staged. He sent the file to his own email, and then to FAR, and then to the number Lena had given him for the Federal Wildlife Authority contact she had been building her case for. Deputy Harlan, the first officer to arrive at the drainage channel, glanced back from the front seat. "You said you're on medical leave." "Yes." "From active service." "Yes." Harlan looked at the road. "You put a 200-pound man on the ground alone with a rifle in play." "I had help," Caden said. Ember looked at Harlan from the back seat. Harlan looked back at her in the rearview mirror, and then returned his eyes to the road without further comment. The substation interview took 90 minutes. A detective named Pruitt asked his questions in the careful, unhurried way of someone building an evidentiary record rather than testing a story. Caden answered in the order events had happened, without interpretation, with the precision he had been trained to bring to after-action reports. He described Ember's role at each point, without minimizing it and without overstating it, because overstating it would create a credibility problem, and Ember did not need her role overstated. What she had done was sufficient on its own terms. Pruitt wrote everything down. Then he looked at Ember, who was sitting beside Caden's chair, with the patient, attending stillness she maintained in every unfamiliar room. "The dog found the primary collection node," Pruitt said. "She found every station on the route," Caden said. "By scent, without prompting. Dr. Marsh has the documentation timestamps. You can map Ember's detection points against the GPS coordinates and see the sequence." Pruitt made a note. "And at the collection node, when Cutter reached for the rifle. She was positioned between me and the weapon before I gave any command." Pruitt looked at Ember for a long moment. "I've been doing this job for 18 years, he said. "I've seen canine units work dozens of times. The dog reads the handler, and the handler reads the threat. There's always a lag, even with good teams." He paused. "You're telling me there was no lag?" Caden looked at Ember. She was looking at the door with the amber eyes and the particular quality of attention that meant she was tracking something beyond the room. Some sound or movement in the building that the humans in the room had not registered. Always working, always attending. "She reads the situation," he said. "Not me. She was reading Cutter's hand before I was." Pruitt was quiet for a moment. Then he closed his notepad and said, "Mr. Cutter has been on our regional watch list for 14 months. His name appears in 2 open missing persons cases that we have not been able to advance without physical evidence connecting him to the location." He paused. "The route Dr. Marsh documented runs within a quarter-mile of both sites where the missing persons were last seen." He held Caden's gaze. "That's not in the wildlife trafficking case. That's a separate investigation that your documentation today may have just opened a door into." The room went very quiet. Caden heard that and felt the weight of it settle. The 2 disappearances Lena had mentioned, not proven, but the pattern is there. Both victims were people who got too close. He thought about the twig snap in the trees the previous afternoon, the deliberate announcement of presence that wanted to be felt. A man marking the people who had found his work and were still standing close to it. "Where is Cutter now?" Caden said. Federal hold, pending the wildlife trafficking charge. The missing persons question is being reviewed by a separate unit. Pruitt stood. You're free to go. We'll need you available for follow-up contact. Don't leave the region without notifying this office. Caden stood. Ember stood with him, pressed briefly against his leg, in the grounding gesture she used when she had assessed that a room had become more serious than it was and that he needed the contact. He put his hand on her back for a moment, and then they walked out. Lena was waiting in the substation's outer area. She looked up when Caden came through the interior door, and her expression told him she had already heard the same thing from Pruitt that he had just heard. The missing persons cases, she said. Yes. She pressed her lips together once. I knew the route connected to those areas. I didn't have enough to say it to anyone officially without it sounding like speculation. She looked at Ember. Now someone can say it officially. Now someone can do more than say it, Caden said. They walked out of the substation into the cold mountain morning and stood in the parking area for a moment. Ember moved away from them slightly and sat facing the forest road with her nose working the air in the slow, exploratory way she used when she was not tracking a specific target, but maintaining general awareness of her environment. Off-duty, in the specific way working dogs were never completely off-duty. Lena looked at her. I need to tell you something. Her voice had shifted from the professional precision she used for case discussion into something more direct and more careful. About Ember. About Paul. Caden waited. Paul Wister trained her for 3 years. He was the best field operator in the Conservation Authority's history, and the best canine handler I've ever seen work. She kept her eyes on Ember. When he died in January, the collapse happened on the North Ridge Trail during a solo survey. Emergency response reached the site in 4 hours. Ember was there when they arrived. She stopped. She was sitting at the collapse point. She hadn't moved. She had stayed with him through the night in single-digit temperatures, and she was still there when the team arrived. Caden said nothing. They had to physically carry her away from the site. She didn't resist, but she didn't leave on her own. Lena's voice was controlled and careful. The tone of someone describing something that still cost them to describe 3 months later. She was placed with a temporary handler while the authorities sorted out what to do with her. She escaped the temporary facility on the 3rd day. We looked for her for 2 weeks, and then we stopped looking, because the terrain she had gone into was the terrain she knew best, the river system north of Rimrock, and we couldn't find her, and she didn't want to be found. Caden looked at Ember. She had turned her head toward him at some point during the account, amber eyes finding him with a complete, present attention that had become the most reliable constant in his last 3 weeks. She wasn't drowning, he said. Lena was quiet. I pulled her out of the river because she looked like she was drowning. He heard his own voice from a distance, working through the shape of something he had been half understanding since the morning he found her paw on his chest. She was in the current. She was caught on the log. Her head was barely above water. Yes, Lena said, but she had been in that river system for 3 months. She knew that current. She knew every approach to every bank in that sector. He stopped. She is a search and rescue dog. She knew exactly how to get out of that river. Lena looked at him without speaking. Caden looked at Ember. Ember looked back at him with the amber eyes that had found him across 12 feet of mountain current and had not looked away since. He thought about the paw on his chest, the placement of it, deliberate and gentle and entirely without urgency, the gesture of an animal that had arrived at its destination and was marking the arrival. Not asking to be saved, offering something. She was waiting, he said. She was waiting for someone to come to the river. Lena exhaled slowly. I don't know how a dog decides something like that, she said. I've worked with animals my entire professional life, and I don't have a framework for it." She paused. "But I know that Paul used to say she could read a person's need from 50 feet out. He said she always knew who needed her before they did." The mountain morning was cold and clear, and the river was audible somewhere below the road. And Caden stood in the parking area of a county sheriff's substation, in his NWU Type 3 uniform, and felt the weight of the last 3 weeks rearrange itself around a center point he had not understood until this moment. He had come to Rimrock Valley to disappear. He had come because Farr had arranged it, and because he had run out of the capacity to arrange anything himself. He had been on medical leave for 19 days and had not once believed that the leave was doing what it was supposed to do. He had pulled a dog from a river because the sound she made was not the kind of sound a person trained to respond to emergencies could walk past. And she had known he was coming. He called Farr from the parking area. Farr answered on the second ring. "Cutter is in federal custody," Caden said. "Wildlife trafficking, commercial operation, multiple stations across the Rimrock sector. The documentation is solid. The Wildlife Authority has everything they need to build the federal case." A pause. "You okay?" "Yes." "Physically?" "Yes, Farr. I'm fine." He looked at Ember, who had come back to his side and was sitting with the amber eyes forward and her shoulder warm against his left boot. "There's something I need to tell you." "Tell me." "I've been sleeping," Caden said, "since the dog. Every night. Through to morning." He stopped. "I didn't tell you that accurately when you asked." Farr was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "I've been waiting for you to tell me yourself." "How did you know?" "Because the first night you don't sleep, the way you've been not sleeping, it changes how you talk. Not dramatically, but enough." Another pause. "I've known you for 6 years, Caden. I know the sound of someone who has found something." Caden looked at the mountains, at the tree line above the substation, at the road back toward the cabin and the river. "She was waiting for me," he said, "in the river. She knew I was coming." Farr was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was the specific voice he used when he was saying the thing that mattered most and wanted to make sure it landed. "Some things find us," he said. "After everything else. After we've stopped being able to look for them. They just find us." A pause. "That's not weakness. That's not something you need to report to a medical board. That's just how it works sometimes." Caden exhaled, the full breath of a man who has been holding something at partial capacity for 6 months and has just been told he can put it down. "I want to talk about what comes after the leave," he said. "We can talk about whatever you want. Not today, but soon." "Whenever you're ready," Farr said. "I'll be here." The call ended. Lena came to stand beside him, both of them looking at the road. Ember sat between them, with the quality of presence she brought to every shared space, complete and undemanding and entirely real. "The Conservation Authority field position," Caden said. "The one you mentioned 3 weeks ago." Lena looked at him. "It's still open. Part-time field patrol, detection work, rescue operations." "Yes. Using everything I have." "Everything," she said. "And everything she has." Caden looked at Ember. Ember looked at him with the amber eyes that had made their decision about him in a river in April, and had not revised it once in the weeks since. The eyes that had seen him through 19 nights of bad sleep and 1 good intervention in a drainage channel, and the specific quiet of a man figuring out in the hardest way possible that the thing he needed had already found him before he knew to look for it. "Okay," he said. "Tell me how it starts." Lena almost smiled. It already started, she said. 3 weeks ago, when she chose you. The Federal Wildlife Authority arrived in Rimrock Valley 4 days after Cutter's arrest, with 2 investigators and a case file that had been building in their regional office for 8 months under a classification that meant nobody outside the investigation knew it existed. Caden found this out when one of the investigators, a woman named Calloway, knocked on the cabin door at 7 in the morning and showed him credentials and asked if she could sit down. He made coffee. She sat across from him at the small table, with a case folder and the specific professional composure of someone who had been doing difficult work for a long time and had arrived at the place where difficult work felt ordinary. Ember sat beside Caden's chair and watched her with the amber eyes and the patient, reading attention she brought to every new person. Calloway noticed. She noticed the way people who work with animals notice things, with recognition rather than surprise. The documentation you recorded at the collection node, Calloway said, has been matched to a compound signature that our lab identified 11 months ago from a sample recovered in a wildlife trafficking case in Oregon. Same supplier, same formula, different region. She set a photograph on the table, not a wildlife photograph. A map with route lines and a cluster of marked points that spread across 3 counties. Cutter wasn't running a local operation. He was a collection node for a network that has been active in the Pacific Northwest for at least 4 years. Caden looked at the map. The route lines converged on a point near the Oregon border, and then dispersed into 3 separate channels that led to coastal ports. The geometry of organized trafficking. Not a poacher working his territory. Infrastructure. The 2 missing persons cases, he said. Calloway's expression confirmed what Pruitt had suggested. Both individuals were connected to the network investigation in ways that weren't known at the time of the disappearance. One was a federal wildlife observer whose survey route overlapped Cutter's collection corridor. The other was a trail maintenance contractor who worked the Forest Service road Cutter used for transport. She paused. Cutter's arrest has opened a cooperation conversation with federal prosecutors. We expect the missing persons investigation to advance significantly as a result. Caden was quiet for a moment. He looked at Ember and thought about the twig snap in the trees. The deliberate announcement. I see you. He thought about what that message would have meant for someone who did not have 10 years of training in how to stand in the presence of a threat and make it understand that threatening you was not its best available option. Lena Marsh, he said. She has been building this case for 3 months, working alone. Every piece of documentation that gave your investigators a starting point came from her. Calloway nodded. She's been formally designated a cooperating witness and will receive full credit in the federal case filing. We're also recommending her for the Conservation Authority's commendation process. She paused. She told us that Ember found the collection node. Ember found everything, Caden said. The fence cut, the route stakes, every bait station, the node, without prompting, in sequence, in terrain she had not previously worked with me. Paul Wister's dog, Calloway said. Yes. She looked at Ember for a long moment. The amber eyes held her gaze with the complete, steady attention they brought to every assessment. Then Calloway looked back at her folder, with the expression of someone who has encountered something that doesn't fit the standard reporting framework and has decided the standard reporting framework needs to expand. The canine contribution is going in the official record, she said. By name. Caden looked at Ember. Ember looked at him with the amber eyes that had been cataloging his interior state since the river, with an accuracy that no medical board had ever achieved. Then she turned back to the room and resumed her watch of the door, because there was a door and someone needed to watch it. Good, Caden said. Calloway left 40 minutes later, with her folder and her photographs, and the specific, satisfied efficiency of someone who had arrived needing information and was leaving with more than she had planned for. Caden sat at the table after she left and drank the last of the coffee, and looked at Ember, and let the full shape of the last 3 weeks arrange itself in his mind, without managing how it landed. He had come to this mountain 22 days ago. He had been in the water on day 19. He had pulled a dog out of a river that she had known how to leave on her own for 3 months, but had chosen not to leave until he arrived. He had followed her through the reserve and found a trafficking network and helped bring it down, and in the process had been shown, in the specific wordless way that some things are shown, that the thing he had come here to find in silence and isolation had been waiting for him in a river. Not peace, not healing in the medical board's language. Something more specific than either of those words. Purpose that didn't require the framework of active duty to be real. Connection that didn't require an operational assignment to have weight. The understanding that the thing that had made him who he was, the training, the instinct, the capacity to respond to a situation that required everything he had, those things did not belong exclusively to deployment. They belonged to him, and they could be used anywhere he decided to use them. He called FAR at 8:30. "The Federal Wildlife Authority was here this morning," he said. "Cutter is connected to a 4-year trafficking network. The case is going federal." FAR was quiet for a moment, with the quality of quiet he used when he was absorbing something larger than the immediate information. "You dismantled a trafficking network while on medical leave." "I followed my dog through the woods for 3 days," Caden said. "She dismantled the trafficking network. I held a man down until the sheriff arrived." A pause. Then, in the voice FAR used when something had genuinely surprised him, which was rare enough to be notable. "How are you?" "Good," Caden said. Then, because FAR had earned the honest version, and because Caden had spent enough time in situations requiring precision to know that approximate answers were a form of disrespect to the person asking. "I'm actually good. Not managing it, not getting through it. Actually good." FAR was quiet again. Not the calculating quiet, the listening quiet. The quiet of someone receiving something they had been patient for. "When does the leave end?" he said. "Technically, 2 weeks." "What do you want to do?" Caden looked at Ember, who was sitting at the cabin door with her nose against the gap at the bottom, reading the mountain morning through the wood. "The Conservation Authority has a part-time field position. Lena Marsh recommended me. It uses everything I have, and it works with Ember." He paused. "I want to request an extension of the leave and take the position." FAR was quiet for a long moment. Caden had learned over 6 years to read FAR's silences the way Ember read terrain, by what they contained rather than what they displaced. This one contained something that was not reluctance and not surprise. It was something closer to relief, the specific relief of a person who has been holding a concern for a long time and has just been told the concern no longer applies. "I'll process the extension today," FAR said. "And Caden, for what it's worth, this is the right call." "I know," Caden said. "Ember told me." A sound came down the line that was unmistakably FAR laughing. Full and genuine. The laugh of a man who had commanded operations in 3 countries and still found something worth laughing at on a Wednesday morning. "Send me a photograph," he said. "Of the dog. She doesn't pose. Then send me whatever you've got." The call ended. Caden looked at the photograph he had taken of Ember on day 3, sitting at the south fence line with the orange stake beside her and the morning light catching the tan and gold of her coat. He sent it to FAR without caption, because no caption was sufficient, and FAR would understand it without one. 3 days later, Lena brought paperwork to the cabin. Not the Conservation Authority employment forms. Those were coming through an official channel and would arrive by mail. These were different. A single page from the Chelan County Animal Authority, official letterhead, with a box at the bottom for a signature. She set it on the table in front of Caden. Formal ownership transfer, she said. Ember's handler of record was Paul. After his death, she became a ward of the Conservation Authority by default. They've agreed to transfer her to you as primary handler, pending your signature. Caden looked at the form. His name was already filled in by the authority in the appropriate field. He looked at the legal language above it, the standard transfer provisions, the responsibility clauses, the acknowledgement of the animal's trained status, and the handler's obligation to maintain that status through appropriate continued work. He looked at Ember. She was sitting 3 feet from the table, watching him with the amber eyes. Not anxious, not waiting in the way that implied uncertainty about the outcome. Just present. The way she was always present. Complete and attending, and entirely without doubt about the thing she had already decided 3 weeks ago in a mountain river. "You chose me first," he said to her. She held his gaze. Her tail moved once. The single arc. The answer that was always enough. He signed the form. Lena picked it up and looked at it, and then looked at Ember with the expression of someone who has been carrying a grief for 3 months, and has just watched it resolve into something that does not diminish the loss, but gives it a direction. "Paul would have approved of you," she said. She said it to Caden, but she was looking at the dog. "I know," Caden said. "She told me that, too." Lena almost smiled. She put the form in her field kit and stood. "Monday morning," she said, 6 a.m. at the South Trailhead. First official patrol. "We'll be there." She left. Caden sat for a while longer at the table, with Ember beside him, and the mountain afternoon coming in cold through the window gap, and the river audible below the ridge, in the way it was always audible. The constant moving presence of a thing that had been running through this valley long before anyone arrived, and would be running through it long after. He thought about the morning he had heard the broken bark, the sound that was not the kind of sound a person trained to respond to emergencies could walk past. He had gone into the water because his training and his nature gave him no other option. He had come out of the water with 80 pounds of German shepherd pressed against his chest, and a warmth in the place where grief had lived, and the beginning of something he had not known he needed until it was already in his arms. He thought about Paul Wister, sitting on a North Ridge trail in January, teaching a dog to stay. Not to stay as in do not move. To stay as in remain. Remain in the world. Remain available. Remain ready for the person who is going to need what you have, even if that person does not yet know they are going to need it. Even if that person is still 22 days away from a river on the other side of the mountain. He thought about the medical board using words like acute stress response and recommended separation. And he understood now what he had not been able to articulate then, that the thing they were treating was not damage to what he was. It was the temporary absence of the place where what he was could be used. Ember had not fixed him. She had shown him that there was nothing broken. She had shown him that what he had built himself into over 10 years was not a liability to manage. It was a capacity to deploy. Here, in this valley, on this mountain, in service of a place that needed exactly what he had. Monday morning came clear and cold. Caden was at the South Trailhead at 5:50, with Ember beside him and his NWU Type 3 uniform pressed, and his boots laced left, then right, and a thermal cup of coffee that he finished before Lena arrived at 6 on the minute. She looked at him, and at Ember, and at the trail ahead. Ready? Ember was already moving, nose down, body methodical. amber eyes reading the frozen ground with the comprehensive attention of a dog who has understood her territory and taken full responsibility for it. She moved with a specific quality that Caden had been watching for 3 weeks and still found remarkable. The quality of an animal that does not require encouragement or instruction or permission to do the thing she was built to do. She simply begins. She is simply already there. Caden fell in beside her. The mountain morning opened around them in layers of cold and light and the sharp green smell of pine after overnight frost. He was 30 years old. He had survived 10 years of combat and 4 deployments and a medical board and 19 days of a leave that was supposed to be about healing and was actually about arriving at the place where healing stopped being necessary because the thing that needed to grow had found what it needed to grow in. He was a Navy SEAL in digital camouflage, walking a mountain trail in Washington state, beside a German shepherd with amber eyes, who had spent 3 months alone in a river valley, waiting for exactly him. They had pulled each other out of the same water, just in different ways, at different depths, in the specific order that made both rescues possible. Some people call it coincidence. Some call it timing. Some call it the particular mercy of a universe that does not always explain itself, but occasionally demonstrates, in the clearest possible terms, that the things we lose are not always gone, and the things we need are not always absent. And the river that nearly takes you is sometimes the same river that brings you exactly what you came here to find. Ember looked back at Caden once from 10 feet ahead on the trail, the amber eyes clear and present and entirely certain. Then she turned forward and kept moving, and he followed her the way he had always followed her, without hesitation, without condition, all the way to the end of whatever came next. He always would. That was the only promise that mattered, and it was already kept.